Hi, Ka. Okay. So, with the topic about similarities and trends in motions. So, there will be 6 parts in this session. First, opening from me as a moderator. And then the second, there is an opening speech from the president of Medan Debaters Forum. And the third, there will be a photo session. And the fourth, there will be a material presentation from Kak Kai. And also there will be a Q&A session and then closing. So without further ado, let's hear the opening speech from the president of Medan Debaters Forum, Bang Fatma. Time and place is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Jessica, for allowing me to give a speech. Before that, am I audible and clear?
Yes, sir, you are all.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, hello everyone. I'm Hotma. I'm acted as the president of the Lembaga Medan Debaters Forum. So this is the organization domicile in Medan, North Sumatra, and we have a mission to proliferate the idea of the public speaking and also the idea to proliferate the idea of the critical thinking through the debate in a parliamentary format. So we have a 3 monthly agenda that we conduct in every month, namely Medan Debate Academy, Kelas Debat Ilmiah, and MDF Reality Matters. And the event that we are enjoying right now is the Medan Debate Academy. So Medan Debate Academy is the monthly webinar when we present a very qualified speaker will deliver to you a very insightful material regarding to the parliamentary debating and how to construct your competitive standard to have a very significant improvement and having the very significant matter regarding to your debating competitions in the future endeavor. So for this moment, we have the Kai Rianto Putra, and this is our honor because Kai Rianto Putra is a very established debater and have a very strong legacy in the parliamentary debating community in Indonesia. And for today, he will give you a very insightful material regarding how to understanding the trends in the motion. And it is very crucial for you to understand these particular topics for having a better significancy to win more competence and to win more competitions in future. So this is the effort of our organizations to give you a non-profit initiatives to proliferate an inclusive movement of the parliamentary debating, giving better opportunity to the young generations to have a chance to speak up their mind and to have the chance to accelerate their capacity in the spectrum of the democracy of our country. And we believe that this is the great moment for you so you can discuss with a very qualified speaker and how you can get the significant and constructive feedback to your competency. So I think that's all that I can say today. Hopefully that you can enjoy this webinar and getting many insights regarding to the materials that we present by Kai Rianto Putra, and hopefully this webinar will give you a better significancy that inspire you to create the same movement in your regions. I think that's all that I can say. Thank you very much, and we back to Jessica to continue the session.
Okay, thank you, Bang Fatma, for the opening speech. Because there is an appreciation to the speaker, so we would like to deliver our certificate of appreciation to our honorable speaker. Okay, I will do the share screen. Please. Okay, so this is the appreciate that can we give for Kak Kai. Thank you so much for your time to be a speaker in this session, which Medan Debate Academy episode 7. Thank you so much, Kak Kai. So we will send this certificate to you after finish this class. Okay, now for the next session is we will do a photo session first before going to material presentation from Kak Kai. For all of you guys can open your camera. Okay, because there are 33 participants, so there will be many part that I will take a screenshot, yeah, guys. Okay, so first part, okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, next, 1, 2, 3. Next, 1, 2, 3. Okay, next, 1, 2, 3. Last, 1, 2, 3. Okay, done. Okay, so next, the material presentation from Kak Kai. So for Kak Kai, time and place is yours.
All right. Hi, everyone. So I've prepared a little slideshow here. So, wait, hold up. Let me just get some things done. Okay, so, yes, I'll start sharing my screen now. So, okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, yeah, yeah.
Yes. Yes.
All right, great. So, I'm going to be looking at both the chat and also my own screen because I have a secondary monitor here. So if you have questions, just you can immediately throw them into the chat and I'll immediately be able to answer them. So yeah, wait 1 sec. Let me just finish ordering this and I'll also be able to see your faces and stuff like that. So if you would like to turn on your camera, that would also be great. But I also understand that turning on your camera is not always possible because of reasons. Okay, so hi, I'm Kai. My full name is Joshua Kai Rianto Putra. If you need to search it up or anything, but it's fine. I've been debating now for I would say 4 years proper. I started in high school. I'm in my second year in university now. Of those 4 years, 5 years debating, I've also been coaching for 3 to 4 years, something like that. And I've been adjudicating for something like 2 years. So I wouldn't say I'm extremely seasoned, and I also wouldn't call myself a dino, but I've been privileged enough to have quite some access to time and facilities in order to develop as a debater. So that's a little bit about me. Now I'm in the University of Indonesia. I'm studying psychology, and I'm also part of the EDS, the English Debate Society in University of Indonesia. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. I think on the poster, there was also some additional information there. So before I start, I want to give a quick disclaimer. So I'm going to share with you some information that I find useful. I'm going to share with you guys some tools and some tricks and some thought processes that I use when I debate. But these are not absolute truths. So it's not like just because I said it, it will definitely be the best way to approach the motion and there's no other way that you can debate. And this is the only way. I think that there are many different ways to debate. And what I'm going to be sharing with you is a relative tool or a relative set of tools that I use that have made, I've found useful, and I've developed these over the years. And I think that they help me look at emotion in a more holistic and unified way. So it prevents me from just making a sporadic case, and it makes sure that the things that I'm saying and the things that I'm arguing are consistent and analyze the motion in multiple different perspectives to avoid it being too shallow. So yeah, all right. So how should you listen to this seminar or this speech or this matter sharing session? I think there are generally two ways you can look at this. The first is I will be going through a lot of different examples of cases and examples of arguments. So you can definitely take note the arguments that I'm presenting, and you can definitely, should you ever meet similar motions or the same motion maybe, you can definitely try to implement these cases. But the other thing is, more than that, I hope to be able to share a system. So that's the second point here, a system, which is a way of thinking that you'll be able to apply no matter what motion you look at. Or I don't want to say algorithm, but like a series of steps that can guide you in the process of case building. So, or just looking at motions in general. So with that, like this is the title, right? Similarities and trends in motions. Specifically, this is about how I look at motions and how this could possibly be applicable to the way other people could look at motions. So there'll be two parts here. The first, I'll talk about similarities between motions, how I think some motions have, like how specific motions are similar with other specific motions in certain ways. So you can think of this as kind of like templates that some motions share. And second, I'll talk about the trends, which is what I think are more broadly applicable, where I think that virtually every motion will have these will have these these trends, these analyses, these burdens, these that they're all burdens will share, all motions will share it to some degree, or at least in my experience, that's been the case. So yeah, let's talk first about similarities. And I have a picture of an eye here because I think that we should all see these similarities. Sorry, that's a bad joke. Okay, so I'm going to go over two different similarities that I see in many different debates. So the first is a debate that happens between free choice and what's called paternalism. Paternalism is the idea that another actor, usually a state, will make a choice for you. So there are plenty of debates, and we'll look at some examples later. I have 3 examples prepared. There are plenty of debates in which one side champions free choice. We should allow people to pick for themselves. People know what's best for themselves. People have different subjective perceptions that allow them to get different benefits, which is why we need to maximize that free choice so people can maximize what they think is best for themselves. But on the other hand, we have a paternalistic idea, which is sometimes people make mistakes. Sometimes people are not rational. Sometimes people make decisions that harm themselves. Sometimes people choose short-term benefits, even though they may have long-term harms, things like that. So so I'll start from the general case that I oftentimes see, then I'll talk about like what I mean by legitimate cases and mistakes to make. So generally, when you talk about freedom of choice, generally people are arguing, okay, people know what's best for themselves. Like autonomy is super important. And I'm sure everyone here, especially if you've seen like WSDC videos, and it'll be like, oh, free choice is super, super important. Free choice is the dignity of human beings. And you'll have lots of jargon and lots of thoughts and lots of big philosophical words that get thrown around in support of free choice. Conversely, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's a good thing. However, if you only explain that it's free choice because of human dignity, sometimes you miss some things because by and large, the approach that opposition will take under this motion is to say that you can't make your own choices. You're not good at making your own choices. You make mistakes, which is like why I have that writing mistakes to be made. Because of this, and we're never really talking about clear-cut cases in debate, right? Because there's always a case for proposition and there's always a case for opposition. So it's not always clear whether free choice is something that people have the ability to do, or whether it's something that's actually useful for them to do. So what I think is the main burden whenever you see a motion that one side supports free choice and one side supports taking away that free choice, then as the person who supports free choice, you have the burden or the ability to, sorry, not the ability, the requirement to explain some legitimate cases where that free choice is actually useful. So it's not just the principle of, okay, free choice for the sake of free choice, people are free, freedom, freedom, free. But you have to show how that freedom translates into people making decisions that benefit themselves. So, and I'm not going to jump into examples first. We'll have you could get from that free choice, then it doesn't really sound like you even have free choice to begin with. Because if you have a free choice, but the free choice doesn't help you, doesn't make your life better, it's just something that is just there, then it doesn't really have any meaningful weight. So broadly, there are two things that you need to check off if you have the free choice. It's one. A is the principal argument, like, okay, freedom is good. But second is you need to manifest that freedom and show why that freedom takes a practical outlook. And this isn't to say that only practical arguments work, yeah, but this is rather to say that your principle only makes sense if it happens in the real world. So if your principle is just a random idea, it's easy for it to fall by the wayside. But if your principle has a concrete, illustrative, like realistic depiction, it's much easier to be bought by the adjudicator. So because there's a legitimate case, the proposition will have a legitimate case. Opposition has something, the opposite that they need to explain, which is if you have a legitimate case and a legitimate reason to want something, then there's a reason why you want it, right? Like maybe you want a certain job. There's a reason why you want a certain job. Maybe it's for the money. Maybe it's because it provides you with a sense of happiness or whatever. So, and that's benefit, right? So opposition, if you're facing this argument, if your proposition brings an argument like, oh, the free choice is useful for this, this, this. So as opposition, you also need to demonstrate why you can cater to the same concerns. You can cater to those same cases. The word that my coach used to use for this is you need what's called a status quo mechanism. A status quo mechanism refers to something that already exists in the status quo, a mechanism that's already there that can cater to, that can deal with the problem that proposition is trying to point out. And in this case, that problem is a choice that they want that provides a certain benefit. So what this doesn't mean that you have to provide the exact thing that they're providing. So for example, if proposition, sorry, I can't get into examples yet because we'll have more later. But if proposition is talking about like, oh, we need these jobs because we need this specific job because it provides money. Perhaps you don't need to argue that you can't argue that you get the same job, right? Because that's the motion. And it's ideal for you to argue how there is an alternative source for you to get money. But you don't necessarily have to argue that you need to get money. Like, why do you need money? Probably it's because like you need a sustainable way of life. You need to get like a bare minimum amount of goods and services. You might just need to argue that there are other ways to get this minimal amount of goods and services, even if you don't have money. Like, I don't know, getting it from your friends and family or something, or maybe government assistance programs. So what I'm trying to say here is that the concern of opposition, you need to answer it meaningfully, but you don't need to answer it exactly. You don't need to answer their specific concern, but maybe you can say this other thing also solves your concern. So that's on legitimate cases, right? Let's talk about mistakes to be made. The reason why I have this written down is because this is what I think will be the main case of opposition, or this whichever side supports paternalism in this debate. So basically what you're arguing here is that people will make a bad choice. So, and this is separate from the previous thing, right? Like maybe there are some benefits from this thing, right? Maybe there are some good things that you can get in very specific circumstances. But under opposition, it's the positive argument that you bring, like previously we were talking about negative arguments, was the positive argument that you talk about here most of the time is how people aren't that smart. Simple to say, like that's the simplest way to say it, is that people make mistakes. People do things that are harmful for them. So for example, in trying to pursue a benefit, like maybe you wanted to get money from a certain job, but because of that, you accidentally sacrifice your health. And that's not something that you can compute for, because your health is something that oftentimes you don't pay attention to. Or yeah, like you should never be able to give up your health for financial gain, for example. And we'll go to specific motions later again. Basically, what you have to prove is that there is something that interferes with the decision-making process of an individual. So usually the typical assumption that people have in debates is, okay, people can decide what's good for themselves. Like people know what they like, people know what they don't like. So you need to demonstrate why in this case, the decision-making process is interfered with. This might be because of addiction. This might be because of age, right? Like this might be because of emotional reasons. This might be because of anything. And really, it doesn't actually matter why they can't make a good choice. But what you need to explain, what you need to make sure you're thinking of when you're constructing a case is, okay, how do I prove that these people, their decision-making process that might be good in other scenarios is interfered with in this specific scenario? So this is to avoid like generalistic explanations. Like a lot of the times they'll be like, oh, we should give things to the poor, or we should take things away from the poor, for example, because like it hurts them. And we'll go into more examples later. But it's to avoid you saying simple things like such as just like, oh, poor people can't make decisions for themselves. Poor people are stupid, because that's not really true. And it's not a very nice thing to say. Oftentimes this will be categorized as what's called an equity violation. So one of the ways you can avoid this is by thinking of, what does the decision-making process look like in this motion? How do people make the decision to take this thing or to not take this thing? And why is there something in this decision-making process that's very difficult, or that's very interruptive, that's very that limits the ability of individuals to make a good choice? So that's something that opposition will bring, or that the side that supports paternalism will bring. For this reason, proposition needs to disprove this. So now we're talking about the negative case of proposition. You need to prove why in this scenario, there are things that you can do that assist your choice. And again, this is where an example where you could use status quo mechanism again. You could depict a mechanism that exists in the status quo that shows that people actually can make choice. Usually that this is something like talking about how information is accessible, or how you can ask as experts, or how you have different perspectives that you can look at, or something like that. Like they're available in society, or as an individual, you do have some degree of not information, some ability to make a decision because, I don't know. Yeah, so just like some ability to make decision. So from this, you can kind of see that two clashes form, right? The first clash is about the benefits, or sorry, is about like how, sorry, the first clash might be like about how rational an individual is, how likely they are to make a good decision, right? So that takes into account opposition's argument about mistakes to be made, and it takes into account proposition's argument about the rationality of individuals. And a second clash might be about the specific scenarios or the benefits and harms that might come from emotion. As you can see, this starts to look a lot like, if you're familiar with the principle practical clash. The first clash is about principle, and the second is about practical. But I want to just point out that beyond just that very general structure that we're all very familiar with, it also takes a more specific version whenever we're talking about free choice versus paternalism. That is free choice versus taking away that free choice for your own benefit. Okay, so this is kind of the general scope. So now let's look at some motions, and I have 3 motions prepared here. I'll talk deeply about 2 of these motions because one of them is very obvious. So here are some examples. Whoa, why did it go backwards? Okay, here are some examples. 3 motions. This house would ban smoking. I'm sure we're all very familiar with that. That's very direct and obvious. Proposition is the one supporting paternalism, right? Proposition is saying that we should take away this free choice from the individual, right? This is where you'll hear arguments about people are addicted, right? And because they're addicted, they can't make a good choice. You'll notice how you're not saying, oh, generally poor people are smokers and they're not good at making their own decisions. But you're using the argument of addiction. Addiction is something that specifically happens in smoking. And that specific thing is what interferes with the decision-making process of individuals, which relates to the why people cannot make a decision, why they'll make mistakes, and then why there'll be a big degree of harm, right? Or you can talk about social pressure, right? I think we're all familiar with the idea that individuals are oftentimes not forced, but pressured by their friends. Like, oh, if you're not smoking, you're not cool, or you should smoke because it's something that's really cool to look at. It's an aesthetic, maybe. Or it's something that makes you not necessarily better, but it's something that makes you cooler, more attractive, maybe more sexy, even perhaps in some degrees. So because of this pressure, and because kids are kind of easy to influence, it's very easy for them to start opting into something, not because they actually want it, but because of that pressure. So again, we're looking at ideas where the decision-making process is interfered with by the inherent, not the inherent, but by the realistic characteristics of smoking, the phenomenon of smoking as it occurs in day-to-day life. So, and conversely, so opposition would be the side that's supporting free choice, right? If you only say, people make their own choice, people they want to smoke, so just let them smoke, it kind of feels like a weak case, because you're not really telling us, like, okay, so you might get addicted to it, you might be pressured by your friends, but why is this something that's like so important? Why is this freedom of choice that's something that's so important to defend? Beyond obviously pointing out that people have like seminars, like we can disseminate information, people know the risks of smoking, etc., etc. What you can also point out is, what you also need to point out rather, is some scenarios where smoking is, I don't want to say beneficial, but provides something unique that nothing else can provide. Like, and you don't have to say that every single person needs to have this benefit, but you need to prove that some people, some of the time, need this. That's why we can't ban it all the time. But sometimes when you're tired after a day of work, or if you're agitated because of a fight, sometimes you need something to calm you down. And sometimes not all people have access to friends who can calm them down. Not everyone has access to therapy that they can pay for that helps them calm down. Sometimes the only alternative, or the most accessible alternative that people have, is smoking, right? And as a quick disclaimer, I don't support smoking. I don't think it's cool. But if I was told that I have to argue against the banning of cigarettes, the banning of smoking, this would be something like the argument that I bring. I would talk about why some people need this in specific scenarios, and why they do have the ability to make a decision to start smoking or to stop smoking. I would talk about how, in the case of addiction, we can create programs like it's called AA. I think it's called Smokers Anonymous. The process by which even people who are addicted can get a mechanism by which they can overcome that addiction. So that's why free choice is still intact. And if it's bad, people won't do it. But sometimes there are scenarios in which it's good, so people will do it. Okay, so that's the first motion, which I'm sure will never show up in a debate because it's so classic. No one ever, like, it's always used as an example. But the second motion here, this house would only allow. Okay, sorry. Before we proceed, there's a question here. Can we give people alternatives? For example, that they can replace tobacco with vitamins. Yeah, that's a great idea, right? So that's something that that's exactly what you need to provide in proposition, right? We talked about how opposition will give, or the paternalistic side will say, you need this specific benefit. And then opposition, or in this case, the proposition, the one who supports free choice, opposition supports free choice, will say, so it becomes a question like, is this substitute, is this replacement something that's exactly the same as the real thing or not? Because here's where you have to be careful. If it's exactly the same, then why are you letting them do it if it's exactly the same, right? If it's just like cigarettes and cigars, they're exactly the same. Why would you ban one and not ban the other? But on the other hand, if they're very different, like say cigarettes versus therapy, that's like two very different things, then maybe there's something unique that cigarettes can give that therapy can't. So if you want to provide an alternative, and it's a very good idea to provide an alternative, but you have to be smart about that alternative. On the one hand, you need to prove that this alternative can tackle the same concerns that the side that supports paternalism, the side that supports free choice is concerned with. So you can deal with stress, for example. And the concerns that opposition brought here was you need to deal with stress in a way that that's accessible, that's cheap, that everyone can have access to. So in proposition, you need the same thing. You need to prove why you can provide that same stress relief and provide that same accessibility, but without the bad parts, like maybe without the addiction or without the tobacco, I don't know, maybe. So for this example, this is a specific example, right? We can replace tobacco with vitamins. What needs to be shown is why this can provide the same sense of stress relief, but perhaps why this isn't addictive. This isn't an addictive substance. Personally, I wouldn't use this example. Personally, I would talk more about like why other things like talking to your friends, I don't know, is something that's more accessible. But I would use this in my mechanism. So I would say for people who are addicted, they can start transitioning off cigarettes by taking steps down, for example, from cigarettes to vapes, from vapes to chewing tobacco, from chewing tobacco to tobacco vitamins, from tobacco vitamins to maybe skin patches. Like there are skin patches that inject nicotine into your blood cells. Into your blood. And then from that only do you stop smoking. So I would use that as a transitioning period, but I wouldn't necessarily use it in arguments. But if you do want to use it in arguments, you need to explain why it's similar in that it alleviates the same problems, but it's different in that it does not provide the same harms. And this is very hard. This is not an easy thing to do, because if it was easy, then it would be an obvious motion, right? Like it would not be an equal motion. But because it's an equal motion, it's very difficult for you to find something that's simultaneously similar, but also different. So I hope that answers the question. Okay, so next let's talk about the second motion. This house would only allow individuals that pass a financial literacy test to participate in the crypto market. What this basically means is if you pass the financial literacy test, so like if you know what a stock is, if you know what a bond is, and all of this stuff, that like you know how the economy works, you know how price fluctuates, maybe you understand supply and demand, only then are you allowed to buy Bitcoin and sell Bitcoin. Only then are you allowed to buy Ethereum, sell Ethereum. Only then are you allowed to invest in Dogecoin, for example. So this is slightly different from the previous motion because it's not a blanket alternative, right? It's not a blanket. It's not a blanket in that every single person is being banned from the crypto market. So that might be a separate motion. And if that's a separate motion, then you'll have to approach that motion differently. But in this case, we're only stopping people if they're not financially literate. This kind of provides an extra benefit for proposition, right? Because you can say like, oh yeah, there are benefits from crypto markets. There are ways that you can get money, but you can't do it if you don't have information. You can't do it if you don't have education. So otherwise you're just likely to lose your money. And I'm not giving you the full argument. You will have to detail this on your own. But what I want to point out here is how the burdens are slightly different in this motion. What this means is that opposition needs to prove an extra step. They need to prove why. So earlier we talked about why it was a meaningful free choice, right? We talked about why you need a legitimate case where doing this thing is beneficial to you. Now what you need to prove is not only is it an additional thing that's beneficial for you, but even if you don't pass the test. So even for individuals who don't pass the test, there's still some benefit that they could get. And yeah, so how do you prove that even without knowledge, it's possible for you to profit? And it makes it a bit, initially it sounds a bit more difficult for opposition to make this case. It sounds like the motion might be a bit unbalanced for proposition here. But there's actually an additional thing to consider here, because the freedom of choice is being controlled by the financial literacy test, right? So what that does is it actually provides an extra burden on proposition. So earlier we talked about why it might be easier for proposition. Now we'll talk about why it might be harder for proposition. It might be slightly harder because they need to prove that the financial literacy test is actually going to be a good thing, right? As in, it's going to accurately test whether you are going to be able to succeed or not in the crypto market. For example, what this means is opposition has an extra argument, which kind of balances it out. They have an extra argument where they can talk about why this test is not actually going to test for your ability to profit in the crypto market, but it's actually going to test for different things. For example, it's just going to use complicated jargon like Keynesian economics, laissez-faire policies, and draconian taxes, like complicated words that you don't actually need to know these terms in order to make a profit in the crypto market. But you need to know these terms in order to pass the test. So maybe this test might not be that beneficial. And maybe the reason why this happens is because this test will be made by experts, right? We would assume that proposition would put that in the mechanism, right? They would put in the mechanism like, oh, this test will be made by experts, la, la, la. And the problem with experts, the problem with people who studied economics for 20 years, 10 years, is that the language that they use is not the language that everyone can access, but rather it's language that only experts understand. And perhaps, yeah, so that's why you could argue that perhaps the test might not be a good test. So proposition now needs to argue, why can you make the test accessible? Why can you make the test in a way that people will understand? Why will this test be what's referred to as internally valid? Like if it's actually trying to test for people's ability to make good choices, does it actually measure that, or does it measure a separate thing entirely? So that's something that you would approach in opposition in regards to this motion. You can see how we're still talking about the freedom of choice of individuals, but in the first motion, it's a concrete block, right? It's all people all the time smoking bad. So the question is about whether smoking is bad or good. But in this motion, the block is untotal. Like not everyone is being blocked. Not everyone is going to be stopped. And there's a mechanism by which this thing happens. This stopping and the starting of ability to trade in the crypto market happens. So the question then becomes, is the way that we block these individuals from accessing the crypto market a good way or a bad way, right? Because another argument that you might bring in opposition, for example, is just that the crypto market is crazy. It's completely fluctuative. There's no way to predict anything. So that means there is no difference between an economic expert and someone who just found it out on Reddit, because it's extremely subjective and extremely crazy. And because of that mechanism, you don't, it's not important to have a financial literacy test because anyone can profit, but anyone can make a loss. So it's just beyond, it's just not something that's, or rather anyone has the potential to profit. And if you hold on to your crypto for long enough, it will profit. So anyone can invest in it. So yeah, there's another question coming in here. Can we argue that by having tests like this, it would be classist because people who cannot afford to study economy or pay to take this test would be disadvantaged? Yes, you can. That's a great point. But that's not yet complete, because if you are saying, so what you're saying is this freedom of choice is something that you're taking away on the basis of class. And that might be a very strong argument. But remember that freedom of choice is only beneficial if we can prove that there's a case where it's useful, right? So this argument relies on you proving that you can profit even if you don't pass the test. Because, for example, let's say that proposition manages to prove if you don't pass the test, you're definitely going to fail. You're going to lose all your money. You're going to lose your retirements. You're going to lose absolutely everything. Let's say that they manage to prove that. It's hard to do that, but it might happen. If you just say, oh, the test is classist, that's not fair. The question then becomes like, why do you want poor people to lose their money, right? Like, why do you want poor people to have access to the ability to lose their money? That doesn't sound like a good idea. And for that reason, it's necessary for opposition to say, even if you don't pass a test, you can still profit. Maybe the test is bad. Maybe it's just not possible to measure someone whether someone will profit or loss. Or another argument that you might bring is generally, if you hold on to crypto for more than a 1 year period, you're going to have a positive return. So it's going to fluctuate crazily. The day-to-day fluctuations are insane. But the year-on-year fluctuations, are a lot more stable. And for that reason, if you just hold on to your crypto for 2 years, you're going to make a profit. And for that reason, this kind of comes into fiat. If you only need to hold on to your crypto for 2 years for you to profit, then, please don't take notes on the slides because it turns out we can see that. But yeah, if you can, yeah, thank you. I lost my train of thought. You need to prove like if you just need to hold on to it for 2 years, then you can then why would you need a financial literacy test? If the financial literacy test is just 1, you should hold on to crypto for more than 2 years. True or false? True. If that's the only thing in the financial literacy test, it's not really a test, is it? So that's something you might argue as opposition. Sorry, there's a follow-up question. If so, can we use Warren Buffett, who became rich because of crypto trading, as an example? So technically, Warren Buffett, he got rich because of stock trading. So he was an investor, not necessarily crypto, but it's very similar. So stocks are very similar to crypto. But yes, you can use this as an example, but you need to point out why this is useful for your case. So you need to point out why, oh, Warren Buffett was able to, even though he was, for example, he was, I don't think he was that rich as a teenager, but he made his first million. Like, I don't know, I'm just kind of running with the example here, but you need to prove why that's meaningful. Like for a proposition, you might say, oh, it's only possible if you're highly educated, which is why we need this test. Or as opposition, you would say that, no, Warren Buffett didn't take official courses. He didn't take, like, I don't know whether that's true or not, but you'll have to look that up. But yeah, so what I want to conclude about this motion is that this is slightly different because the limitation on free choice is on whole. It's not a total block on free choice. So that's for the second motion. Now let's look at the third motion, which is actually, not everyone computes that this is actually the same debate, right? It's the same debate because one side is saying, okay, this house regrets the narrative that college is the primary path to success. You're wondering, like, whose free choice are we taking away here? But generally, you would think that if there's a narrative in society, people are going to be influenced by that narrative, right? Like people are more likely to make their choices based on that narrative. Or they're going to be pressured, pressured to follow that narrative. So if we look at this in reality, this will be like, sorry, I should keep this in English. Like, oh, if you don't go to college, you're going to be a failure. Or if you don't get accepted into PTN, into a public university, you're not smart. Or like, you're not going to be successful. Or if you want to like, that narrative that in order to be successful, it's like all of these things kind of shame individuals into going into college. So maybe this isn't an explicit ban, like you have to go to college. We're taking away your free choice to not go to college. But this is almost like a soft ban in the sense that we're going to influence you to take college. We're going to push you away from dropping out. We're going to push you away from taking the choice to not go to college. And for that reason, you can kind of see that proposition side of the house is a side that supports free choice, because we don't want people to be influenced. We want people to make their own choice, because there are different ways to get to success and different people need different things, and everyone should take an individualized choice, right? Whereas in opposition, you would say, no, people who drop out usually drop out because they're lazy and they think they can succeed anyways. Or people who drop out, they're usually young people who who don't understand like what's important in the long term, yada, yada, yada. So you can see how it follows the same structure, even if it's not intuitively using the word ban or allow. So just double check, especially when you're dealing with narrative motions. I find that there are quite a lot of motions that fall into this system, that fall into this this template beat. So what I want to say in terms of proposition is you want to, earlier we talked about cases where you need to have a legitimate case, right? So you need to have an example of why not going to college is something that's useful. And the more widely applicable this is, the more likely that you're going to win this debate, because this is kind of a soft debate in that it's not like ban or not ban, but it's like it's a narrative. Is a narrative strong or weak or something like that? So the most obvious one is like, oh, being a musician, you don't need to go to college to be a musician. But beyond that, maybe you can talk about how actually the skills that are used in the majority of jobs are skills like using Excel, are skills like communication, are skills like strategic business decisions, which might not be things that are exclusive to college. So maybe you want to add that there's a rise of MOOCs. I forgot what that stands for, but massive something online courses. And because of this massive rise, people have access to get the useful skills that they need. They can get all of these skills. So for that reason, and it's much cheaper, for example, it's much more accessible. And for that reason, you don't need to go to college anymore. So this narrative is not really useful. This narrative it just makes people spend extra money. And the skills that they get, like maybe how to cite a paper. If I don't know who's in university and who's in high school, but something I learned a lot was like how to cite an article properly. And if you want to cite an article, the only real place where you're going to use that is if you're going to become a professor and you're going to write papers, because you have to do citations based on APA standard, or APA is an American Psychological Association, or Harvard standard or Chicago standard. Like you need to know these methods, but that's only if you want to become like a professor. If you want to become even a journalist who still has to cite their sources, you have a bit more freedom of how you cite your sources, because it's just like it's an article. It's not, or it's a publication on the New York Times, not the Journal for Medicinal Health of America. So that for that reason, you're telling that the argument is that the alternatives that you can provide are substantially beneficial for a lot of people. Like there are a lot of people who don't need to go to college, and because they are college, and a college has its benefits. I rambled a bit. Sorry, I did too many details. But college has specific benefits, but only if you want to become a professor, only if you want to work in academia, or maybe college is specifically useful if you want to become a doctor who you need a very specific certificate. Maybe it's only useful in that scenario. But if you want to become a business owner, if you want to become a middle class worker, if you want to become middle management, maybe you don't really need college and something like that. So conversely, on opposition, then, what you need to prove is that actually these skills are beneficial. So one, you need to prove, like in rebuttal, you need to prove that these skills are beneficial. Like it's useful for you to learn how to think critically, how to figure out whether this thing has been sufficiently proven or not, which honestly sounds a bit like debate, right? How to write in a way that's easy to understand. These are things that you learn in college. Or how to cite articles, because like citing maybe not the process of just citing, but the idea of having conversations based on evidence. So when you say something, you prove it. You don't just speculate like, I think people are like, I think poor people are stupid. No, don't just say that. Prove it. If you want to make that argument, then cite yourself properly, right? Have substantial evidence, and you can distinguish between what's a hoax and what's real, what's valid and what you can cite, and what's just some random person on the internet speaking gibberish. So that would be something that you would prove in opposition, like these skills are useful. But the second thing that you need to point out was we need to talk about how mistakes, like it's likely that if this narrative doesn't exist, people will make mistakes, right? Because their free choice is not being limited. So you need to talk about why there's something about college that it's hard for people to make a choice of their complete free will, and they need to be influenced, they need to be nudged to exhibit a certain behavior. And one way that you might answer this is by saying like, okay, the skills that university teaches is useful, but they're useful in very long-term ways. It's difficult for you to see the use right here, right now. So that's why if people pick the courses for themselves, like they pick their own MOOCs, they're likely to pick things that are useful in the short term. Like maybe they know how to do Excels, maybe they know how to fill in spreadsheets, but maybe they don't know something that will only become important 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line. It'll only become important once you've seen the broad trajectory of your choices over a decade of your life. Then it'll only become obvious that, oh, I made a mistake here. Like I made these decisions weren't made based on sound evidence. They were made based on speculation and logic. And logic is good, but logic isn't always the most important thing in making a decision. Sometimes you need evidence, which is why we had the ADAL structure. And for that reason, people need to be nudged towards college, because if they don't, they won't pick up these skills that are extremely useful, but people don't notice that they're useful. So that might be an argument that you need to bring, that you could bring in opposition, that it proves two things. Like one, it proves that college is actually useful in the vast majority of cases, but two, people aren't likely to pick it for the right reasons. Like if we don't influence them to do it, they won't opt into it because they don't think it's useful, or they don't realize that they're being taught an important skill. Because we don't really have like, or at least I don't have in my classes, I don't have like a critical thinking 101 class, but critical thinking is something that's baked into each and every single class. They ask you to think critically in different ways. So I want to give an additional argument to proposition, which is that this is very similar to the classist argument that the person who asked in the previous motion, which is you could argue that in the status quo, college is not actually useful, but because everyone thinks it's useful, because there's a narrative that it's useful, people start including it in jobs as requirements for jobs that actually don't require degrees. So this is how you have like receptionists, but you have to graduate from undergrad before you can become a receptionist, things like that, or something like that. So or you're just like a job where it doesn't actually require a bachelor's degree, but they just require it anyways. Typically, the example of this is when like you have a bachelor's degree, but they don't actually care what bachelor's degree it is. It's like, as long as it's a bachelor degree, we don't care, because it actually doesn't need it. And what you can say is because it's a manufactured standard, because it's not a real standard, you bias the world to benefit individuals who can afford college, because not everyone can afford college, right? Like college is expensive. In Indonesia, if you get into a PTN, it's very accessible. But if you have to go to a private university, or worse, if you have to go to America, where you're taking like $200,000 in debt, $200,000 is like the price of a house, 2 miliar. Sorry, I'm not getting the. It's like maybe 3.7 miliar. 3.4, 3.7. I don't know. For Absen, I'm not providing Absen. If there is one from the Medan Debate Forum, I'm not sure, but you can ask them about that. Okay, so I wanted to say that college was expensive, right? And because it's expensive, not everyone can afford it, which means that these people, these poor people who are actually qualified, who are actually smart, because earlier we said that college doesn't provide useful information, they're barred from getting into certain jobs. They don't have the ability to become middle management or executives, because these executives have useless degrees that are just there because they had the money to pay for them. So what you really want to look at is whether, so that might be an example, that an argument that you could bring in proposition. But in opposition, you could kind of reverse this argument, right? Because if you'll notice that this argument relies on you proving that college is useless or is not always useful, which is why these useless degrees, or these degrees that don't actually impact your work, are being used as a prerequisite. So in opposition, if you're able to prove that these skills are useful, that you do need these skills, that actually the things that you learn in college are useful, then you can still take down this argument. So the argument still ends up becoming whether or not there's a legitimate case for this coercion to happen. Like if there's whether or not people are rational or not, whether or not people. So similar arguments. Earlier when I was arguing for prop, I said like, oh, it doesn't really matter. The fact that it doesn't matter what degree you have, they just want a degree, proves that it's actually useless. In opposition, you could flip this. You could say, no, actually, the fact that it doesn't matter what degree you have actually proves that it's not the specific skills that are important, like the specific things that you learn in psychology about the brain, or the specific things that you learn in data science, like how to code in C++. It's actually the general mindset that's shaped. That's what's important. And this is something that happens regardless of whether you go to psychology or data science or economics or linguistics. So for that reason, it kind of demonstrates that there's a case that, yeah, you can interpret examples in different ways, but you need to interpret it in a way that fulfills your burdens. So yeah, okay. So this is that's the first template, free choice versus paternalism. I have a second template here, which is quality versus quantity. And I'm going to try and spend less time here because I realize it's already 11 o'clock. And also this is, it's not really easy to depict what I mean by quality versus quantity. So I'll go straight to the examples, and then we'll look at some common threads that exist in this debate, in this type of debate. So what we're talking about, so here's my examples. This house supports the rise of performative activism. Performative activism is like when you post a black square on and say hashtag BLM, or when you just send a link for like some discourse that people have had. So, or like you just send a tweet like, oh, women's rights matters. Like, yeah, we get it. Sorry. So like performative activism would be something it's activism, but it's not definitely useful. Like it's not clear what the benefit is, and people are just doing it for the performance. Like people are getting angry and just to feel morally superior, etc., etc. And second motion, this house believes game designers should prioritize over everything else the creation of female characters. And third motion, this house supports the rise of teenagers at the forefront of social movements. If you'll notice, these are all kind of motions about social change. Like they're motions about how do we change perceptions? How do we change, how do we support feminism? How do we support, so one of them actually has the word social movements in it. Like, is performative activism something that's beneficial for social movements or not? And generally, when you're approaching this kind of debate, there are two ways to get social change. One is to get a whole lot of people on board with your cause. So this is what I mean by quantity. A lot of people buy in to what you have to say. And this would be what opposition supports in the first motion. Because opposition is like, oh, a lot of people can do performative activism. It's accessible. Lots of people can do it. It's easy to share. In the second motion, it might be proposition that supports quantity amount, because it doesn't matter what, but as long as we have lots of female characters, as long as we have lots of girls in the games and in the characters, as long as we have lots of women, then that's the mechanism through which we can achieve social change, because we're more likely to affect a broad range of people. And for the third motion, also perhaps proposition is the one that sides with quantity when they say that perhaps teenagers can influence other teenagers and can get lots of people on board, and perhaps teenagers can also influence older people, because like, oh, older people are like, oh, I can't believe that my own granddaughter would have to do something like this in order to be heard. So that's on terms of quantity. And that's a very straightforward argument, a very direct argument. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. We can generate awareness. But the other side of the coin is one of quality, which is to say, sometimes you would argue that not all forms of awareness are good. For example, in the first motion, you could argue that, sure, you get lots of people, but there's no concrete tangible output. These people don't go onto the streets to they don't try to change policy in government. They don't try to make other people's lives more comfortable. They just post a black square and call it a day. And then they feel like, oh, I've done my job. I've said women's rights matter today. So that counts as my contribution to the movement. I don't need to do anything else. So you can argue that, sure, there are lots of people doing things, but they're not doing anything useful. And for that reason, it's more beneficial, like they're not doing anything useful and you're diverting their energy away. So instead of providing safe spaces for trans individuals, you just say trans rights matters, for example. Or instead of working to create policy changes or working to make a space where Black people feel heard about their issues of police brutality, you just post a black square and call it a day. So for that reason, it's better for you to have a mechanism of activism that's not as easy to access. Like perhaps not everyone can opt into a discourse about what makes Black people afraid of the police. Perhaps that's not everyone can opt into that discussion, but at least it creates a meaningful, tangible impact. Perhaps it does something, something in that regard. Sorry, okay, I need to speed up. For similar thing for the second motion, this House believes, so for the female games, like proposition might argue like, oh, you have lots and lots of people who are making female characters, but what if those female those female characters will probably be sexualized, will probably not have a deep character arc. Maybe they won't be good characters. Maybe they will only support the idea that women are just objects for men to use or whatever. And I'm sure like if anyone's active on games, you'll see how prevalent the sexualization is of the female body on games. Like no one's wearing a reasonable amount of clothes. Everyone has unrealistic, like they're unrealistically slim, but unrealistically thick at the same time. So as opposition, what you would argue is that it's better for you to work harder on a smaller amount of characters. So perhaps you don't just randomly make lots of characters, but you really devote time and effort into creating a really good character that really represents women, that really presents a realistic depiction of what it's like to be a woman. And perhaps that's more likely to change the perception of men, of gamers who I don't really have proof of this, but like I generally feel that gamers are more likely to be sexist than people who aren't gamers, or maybe that's just an assumption that I have. But since we're talking about gamers here, then the argument needs to talk about how you can change the perspective of gamers specifically. Or in the third motion, where we're talking about the rise of teenagers at the forefront of social movement, if proposition is talking about how easy it is to recruit people into your movement because it's more palatable to use teenagers, opposition can focus on quantity and can talk about how, on the one hand, you have in order to actually create policy change, or in order to actually change the social norms of individuals to make them more likely to use, I don't know, plastic straws, less likely to use their cars, things like that. It's not enough for you to just have a teenager to say it, but you need to have a credible expert, because credible experts are the one who can lead you to do concrete actions. They can tell you like, oh yeah, actually the most useful thing to do is X, Y, Z. And then you can have a debate about whether or not these teenagers have adequate information or not. And you can have a debate about whether or not these experts can sway a broad number of people. So I'm going to go to the next slide now. There are two questions that I think that you need to think about when you're approaching this motion, this type of motion. Because if you'll notice that whenever it's a quantity versus quality debate, both sides of the house want the same thing. They both want the benefit towards the feminist movement. They will both want the benefit towards the green movement. They both want benefits towards, I don't know, maybe the left movement. Sometimes you'll get motion like as leftist XYZ. So since they're both targeting the same benefit, sometimes the question that you need to answer is, what is the benefit that you're looking for? And I want to make a distinction here because a lot of debates revolve around having a conceptual benefit. Like, oh, it's good for you to increase awareness. It's good for you to have more followers. It's good for you to pursue the feminist agenda or something like that. But that's not a very, sorry, there's a question that came here. I'll finish talking about benefits and I'll go to the question. It's not necessarily clear whether awareness is, like, what's that going to look like in real life? More generally, when you talk about awareness is only beneficial if you do one of two things, generally speaking. One is if you create a policy change, which is like, for example, through awareness about the harms of gun ownership, you're able to change gun regulation in America, for example. Like, that's a tangible benefit, right? So awareness is a step in order to create policy change. Or awareness might be useful for you to create a social change. So if it's not policy change, it's social change and a change in the social norm where, for example, let's say performative activism creates a space in which like Black people are more likely to be listened to instead of just being shunned for their experiences. So what this means, what this directly translates to is for you to provide a safe space for Black people, right? So that's like a concrete benefit. So I want to make a distinction here whenever you're arguing on these goal-based motions where both sides of the house have the same goal. You need to make sure that you're arguing on a basis that's really concrete and not just conceptual. So yeah. All right, let's go to the question. But if female game designers would focus more on female characters, would it be sexist to the male game characters? Since currently female game characters are marketed towards men and male game characters are marketed towards women. That's an interesting angle to tackle. I'm not sure. Okay, I'm not a gamer, but in my observations of the gaming scene, the gaming area, generally there are vastly more men than there are women in games, I think. And because of that, it's quite an echo chamber. Like this is why sexualization of women happens very rampantly in the gaming industry. And I've actually found arguments to say that female characters are marketed towards men, which is why they're dressed very sexily, etc., etc. But male characters are also advertised towards men, which is why they look like the male body ideal that men like. Like they have like big muscles, they're cool, they're aloof, things that women might not necessarily like, but men think that's the ideal man, so it kind of gets baked into character design. So to answer the question, I think I'll answer it by using my conversation about benefits. Like, if you want to say that it's sexist, if you want to say that it's unfair, if you want to say that it's biased, that's an example of a conceptual benefit or a conceptual idea, like, it's sexist. But if you can translate that into something that's concrete, like, so for example, the sexualization of women in the gaming industry makes it uncomfortable for women to opt into the industry. So like they actually want to play games. They want to play Valorant. They want to play, not PUBG. PUBG only has guys. I don't know. PUBG doesn't. Oh yeah, maybe PUBG. PUBG has guys and girls. Maybe they want to play Paladins. Maybe they want to play God of War. But it becomes very uncomfortable because there's so many. The sexualization of women is so rampant. So that's why it's probably better for us to not just randomly have lots of women characters because they would be sexualized, like how they have like a lot of very like useless nude scenes in God of War. And I think there are like a couple of very unpleasant rape scenes as well. Maybe it's better for you to have a very small amount of women characters, but they're made in a way that's very suited towards these women, so these women feel comfortable with when they're playing. Like maybe that's something that you would like to argue. So you can see how that translates into like a realistic, like a real benefit that's tangible and that's concrete. Okay, so that's on the benefit. On the prerequisite, what I mean for prerequisite is I want to say that once you've established, like, let's take the third motion, for example. The third motion was supporting, let's go back. The rise of teenagers as the forefront of social movements. Let's just say that we've agreed that the benefit that we want to pursue is policy change. We want to create carbon regulations on big companies. We want to hold Chevron accountable for their oil spills. Or like, I don't know, we want something concrete. And I'm going to give an argument for opposition here because I just thought of a really cool argument for opposition. What you need to prove is the prerequisite for you to achieve that benefit. So it's not just any kind of awareness will eventually create a policy change, but rather you need to point out, like, you need to quantify, like, whose mind do we need to change in order to generate a policy change? How much support do we need in order for us to create a policy change? So it's a more quantifiable question, which establishes what the prerequisite is for you to achieve this benefit. And for example, for opposition, you might want to argue that, okay, so we want to create tangible benefits. We want to create tangible benefits for social movements. Let's say, for example, the Green Movement. Let's take the example of Greta Thunberg. What you can point out is you can say that we want concrete changes, but at the same time, we're not sure which concrete changes are the right choices to make. Some experts think that banning meat would be very beneficial for the green movements. Some people think that banning meat would have no positive benefit, and that there are actual experts who have varying opinions on that. Some experts think that, I don't know, if we're going to use the example of Malala in education in, I forgot if it was Taliban or Pakistan. I think it's Taliban. If we want to use the example of Malala, or of that movement, the movement for education for women in Afghanistan, maybe it would be beneficial for you to have a military intervention from US, but that's a whole separate motion, right? I think we're all familiar with that motion. So it's not clear what the benefit is. It's not clear what sort of concrete change we want to make. It might be an intervention from the US, it might be an intervention from China, or maybe it's just a soft intervention from India, for example. I don't know. And for that reason, that's why we need experts, because it's not enough for you to just have awareness. It's not enough for you to just have people who say, oh, support Malala, support whatever Malala wants, etc., etc. We need to have experts at the forefront of these movements, people who studied international politics for years so they know whether the war will be beneficial or not, or people who have studied green policies for decades, because only then can you actually understand the long-term impact of these policies. So perhaps you don't create the largest amount of change. Like maybe not everyone is using using rubber straws, but maybe rubber straws aren't actually useful to begin with. Like who knows? Like yeah. And there's someone asking here, like, would performative activism argument be valid in this motion? Since teenagers would perform would perform activism by canceling people online. Like, yeah, you can argue that. You can argue like when teenagers are at the forefront, maybe they call for things like canceling. And maybe canceling is beneficial in specific scenarios. Maybe we do want to cancel Harvey Weinstein and Alan Wood. I forgot who his name, but he was like a rapist in the movie industry. Maybe we do want to cancel these specific people, but canceling is not always de facto the right answer. which is why we cannot have teenagers at the forefront. We need to have experts, people who have dissected whether cancel culture will work on this individual or not, that sort of thing. So what you can see here is we're looking at the prerequisite for the benefit. We're looking at whether or not the benefit is really useful, or whether it's just, whether or not this certain change that we're creating, whether that will actually create the benefit, or if it will just like push us towards the benefit. So notice you can see there's a difference between you arguing, okay, experts know better, so they can make better policies, versus telling me that there's a problem, and the problem is the unclear information, the gray area of a variety of different problems that encompass social movements. And for that reason, you also need a varying difference of responses. You need important discussions. And that kind of makes opposition feel more, or the side that supports quality feel more important than the side that supports quantity. So that's the second similarity that I see between a lot of motions. When you have a motion that has quantity versus quality. So when you see this motion, I want you to think about like, what are the benefits here and what are the prerequisites in order for you to achieve that benefit? And what I want to point out here for the second question, again, for prerequisites, is that it's not definite. Like, it's not definite that this is the prerequisite. There's no other reason that there's no other prerequisite that could be provided. But if you want, you can implement what you think a prerequisite is that benefits your side of the house. So in some certain situations, you have to prove that your prerequisite is the right prerequisite, right? By proving that this is the prerequisite that will actually create a good change, which kind of ties it to the benefit. But like, basically what I'm trying to say is that if you want to rebut the prerequisite, you can also do that. If you want to change the prerequisite in your case, you can do that, so long as it sounds logical and so long as it's there. You just need to have a prerequisite for your case to make sense. Otherwise, it's going to be very conceptual. Like, okay, I get the logical structure that awareness might lead to change, but if proposition will say, oh, we have more awareness, and opposition will say, oh, we can still have awareness, right? We have other status quo mechanisms that can provide this awareness. So everyone's saying, okay, we can have awareness, but okay, so let's quantify it. So do you pass the threshold of minimum awareness required, or what's the type of awareness that's necessary? Yep. Okay. So it's hitting 11:30, and my target was to finish this all by 11:30, but we still have one more bit. And now we're going to talk about trends. What I mean when I say trends are, earlier I pointed out, these are things that I think apply to every single motion, or to virtually every single motion. So we're not going to have examples here. I don't think we have time for example. We might have time for example. We might not. We'll see how it goes. Okay. So basically, I think there are two trends to pay attention to. The first is common ground. And what I mean by trend is I think the trend of how a debate operates as it progresses through speakers. So in the beginning, you're arguing something, and then you're arguing something. And I think that the first trend is that you will eventually establish a common ground. What I mean by this is there's going to be something that you agree on to be beneficial. There needs to be something that you agree on. And from this thing that you agree on, you need to establish who has a better mechanism of achieving it. And this becomes very similar to like assessing like what's the benefit, what's the prerequisite, because you both agree on what a benefit is, and you both agree on what and you might not agree on what the prerequisite is. So you need to figure out what the prerequisite is to achieve this benefit that lies in the common ground. So, okay, That's the first thing, right? You need to think about, this is something that I always find out happens by the end of the debate. Like, okay, there'll be some sort of concession made somewhere. The second thing is comparative ground, which I just made it to start with a C, so it's pretty. But by comparative ground, what I mean is by comparing two opposing benefits. Two opposing benefits, like, or maybe you've agreed that something is sorry, like one person is pursuing benefit X and one benefit is pursuing benefit Y. In this case, there are two things that you usually need to do. And usually there will be common ground in a debate, and there will also be comparative ground in a debate. Usually there are two things you need to do. First is to prove why opposition's benefit can also happen on my side, why my opponent's benefit I can also achieve. The second thing that you need to do is you need to realize that, okay, the debate is not, given that like sometimes some arguments are easier to make in opposition, some arguments are easier to make in proposition. Sometimes it becomes apparent that you might lose a clash. So for that reason, not only do you try to win that clash by like saying, oh, we can still achieve that benefit, but the other thing you need to do is point out why your argument is more important than their argument. So if they have benefit X and you have benefit Y, then you need to talk about why your benefit is more important. So if it's an economic motion, say like, I don't know, this house regrets the rise of online shopping. I don't know. Maybe proposition would say, we regret the rise of online shopping because people spend more money and buy things that they don't need. And opposition might say, we support online shopping because it provides avenues for small businesses to get shopping, to get revenue. So people are pursuing different benefits. One is pursuing a benefit for the consumer, and one is pursuing a benefit for the producer. Also, I don't actually know if that's a good motion or not. I just came up with it from the top of my head. But in a comparative ground, one side has the more obvious, once you've established who's supporting what, you need to have a debate on which one is more important. Okay, so are consumers more important, or are producers and sellers more important? Is the rising idea of consumerism something that's more harmful or less harmful than the ability for small businesses to get profit? Oftentimes, you would have to answer this question by dissecting, oh, who's the more vulnerable actor? Who has other alternatives? Things like that. And I'm not going to give you the answer to that question, because what I want to point out is not specific matter for that motion, because I don't know if it's a good motion anyways. But what I want to point out is that, how should I say this? Within all debates, you're going to have to figure out whose benefit is more important. So I would encourage you to, like, next time you have a sparring session, especially if it's AP, for you to just write down common ground, comparative ground, and figure out in what parts do you agree. If you agree, then how can you establish a parameter that proves your benefit is more likely to happen? And when you have a comparative ground, you can figure out, A, how do I prove their benefit on my side of the house? And B, how do I prove that my benefit is more important than their benefit? And you can kind of see that inside the comparative ground, there is another common ground. Like, because if you want to say like, oh, I can achieve their benefit on my side of the house, then you're kind of agreeing that there's a benefit, and that's a good benefit, and you just need to prove whether you can achieve it or not. And then you would use like, what's the prerequisite again, right? And similarly, if you want to prove that your motion is more important, the opposition might try and prove why they can get that same benefit. So you also have to put a prerequisite. So inside the comparative ground, there are going to be common grounds. Inside the clash, there are going to be arguments. So how do we use this? I messed up the order of the slides. So how do we use this? How do we use these two tools, comparative ground and common ground, in a debate? What I want is for you to case build with the whole debate in mind. The mistake that I made when I started out debating is I would just make arguments. I would say, oh, I could argue this, I could argue that. This makes sense, that makes sense. I could put this in my speech. But I did not take the whole debate into account. What do I mean by the whole debate? Two things. What I mean is the whole debate in regards to what opposition thinks. So if I think like this argument might work, I also need to think what argument what might work on opposition, because there's going to be a good argument on both sides of the house. And then how do I prove that my good argument is more important than their good argument? How do I prove that I can win on the comparative ground? But the second thing is you need to case build with the progression of the debate in mind, how the debate would likely end up in the second or third speakers or even reply speakers. How would this debate end up how would this debate be adjudicated by the adjudicators, by the judges? And what this means is you need to take into account that when I bring an argument, yeah, it needs to be compared. I need to figure out how this is going to end up fitting into a clash in the end of the debate. And it might fit into a clash if it fits into a common ground or it fits into a comparative ground. Generally, the trend section of this debate, of this webinar is slightly harder to implement into a debate. It's kind of an art in the sense that it's very easy for you to say these tools, but using these tools is a bit more difficult. Using these tools is a bit more difficult, but I want you to think about it conceptually like, okay, have I answered opposition's main concern, right? Have I answered why my concern is more important than their main concern? Are there points where I agree with the opposition? And if there are points where I agree, how do I prove that there's something more, that the prerequisite for the benefit is more substantive on my side of the house? Okay. So I kind of have like 27 more minutes. And we're nearing the end of this. So I want to take a look at one more motion. This house believes that schools should aggressively stream students according to their ability from a young age. And this is an education motion. So I'm going to take a look at how I would apply these two tools while I'm case building, and I'll kind of case build both prop and op, gov and affirmative and negative, gov and op. In thinking about this motion, my thoughts for proposition is, oh, okay, like the first thing you think is, okay, people are going to get like better jobs. I don't know. Because like they have access they get trained in what they're good at. They're more likely to go to university, et cetera, et cetera. In opposition, I'm thinking like, oh, people should have freedom of choice to pick what they want, because maybe they want different things. So like that kind of brings us to the first motion, right? You'll kind of see how like even this motion, it fits into the parameter of freedom of choice versus paternalism, because proposition wants to make decisions for these kids on their own. Opposition wants to let them make their own choice later on. For common ground, what I'm thinking of here is I'm thinking that proposition and opposition might be arguing about like, oh, how you're likely to get jobs. All right, sure, I can finish this up by 11:40. Proposition and opposition might argue about how it's better, how you can better get jobs. But personally, I think that this is an example of a conceptual benefit, not an actual benefit. Like, okay, like, so what if you get jobs? Like, it's not, the reason why people get benefits is get jobs is because they want to be happy. Like, yeah, like if you can argue that someone doesn't have a job, but they're happy, you're probably more likely to win the debate. For that reason, when I'm making my arguments, it's not enough for me just to argue that I can get these people good jobs, but I need to figure out how these good jobs will lead to happiness. Which like intuitively, it gives me an idea like, oh, for opposition, we could argue like, oh, maybe you don't get the smartest job, maybe you don't get the biggest salary, but you make enough to live and A, you get enough to live, and B, you make enough, you make something that gives you fulfillment. So maybe you're not the best at your job, but you like your job. In opposition, you're like in proposition, then you would have to argue that same question, like, why is this success something that's so important? Like, I'm not super sure how to answer that question in this particular point, because I haven't case built it for 30 minutes yet. But what I'm showing you is, like, by thinking about both proposition and opposition, if I was prop, now I figure out, oh, there's this hole in my case. Like, how do I answer? How does this make me happy? So that's for common ground. For comparative ground, I might think about how on our side of the house, on proposition side of the house, it might be more important. You might have more education, like people might be smarter because they can learn things better, whatever. But opposition, you might have more meaningful social connections, because when you have different social connections from people from different walks of life, for example, like, because you're making friends with people who would eventually specialize in different things, whereas in proposition you all specialize in the same thing if you're in the same class. It's more likely that you have more interdisciplinary friendships who can provide you with different perspectives, maybe. I don't know. But what you can see is that's a conceptual benefit. That's not an actual benefit. So I have to detail that further if I was to case build for opposition. But for proposition, I would realize that, okay, one person's arguing education and one person's arguing social benefits. Why then is my benefit more, how can I prove that social benefit can also be achieved on my side of the house? Like, how do you make friends on my side of the house? I need to have that argument. I've established that by thinking of the whole debate, by using this comparative and common ground. And secondly, I need to think of how education is more important than social connections. And in actuality, it might not be. Maybe one is more important than the other. Maybe they're equally important. But for the sake of the debate, you do need to answer this to make your case stronger. So yeah, that's an example of how I would case build for this motion. How I would take into account common ground and comparative ground, how I would think of things like on a conceptual level than on an actual level, and how that would bring me towards having a case that's, I believe, is more holistic. So yeah, I hope this helps. And now I guess it's 11:39, so I have 1 minute to spare. We have 20 minutes for question and answer, so I would hand it over if you want to ask me direct questions in the chat, or if you want to send the chats to Jessica. I think either one is cool. But yeah, so that's a bit on that. Those are my thoughts on how to see similarities and trends in motions.
So nice, Kak, your material. And the others, guys, if you have any questions, you may drop your questions in the chat box, or just unmute your voice, then you speak directly to Kak Kaya, guys.
Sorry, we have one question here directed at me. Does the word aggressively have any worth in this motion? All right, so we're looking at the previous motion, right? Okay, so streaming is not something that's uncommon. Every single person in Indonesia is streamed to IPA or IPS or Bahasa. So the wording aggressively, I think, is necessary in order to make the debate more reflective of reality, because the fact is people are streamed, right? But the reason why we need the word aggressively is we're going to do it even earlier, even younger, even more. So it's to just clarify what the difference is between opposition and proposition. So the conversation that you would have, and this is a great point, is it's not whether streaming is good or bad, right? Because like, yeah, the wording is not just this house would stream students. The question is whether this method of aggressive streaming is good. The question is whether streaming is better to be done from childhood without the free choice of the kids, because like it's according to their ability, right? Or is it better based on their free choice, when they hit high school or when they hit university. So the word aggressive, I personally don't think it's an absolute necessity to have it in the motion, but it's there, in my opinion, to make the motion more reflective of reality. As long as you keep in mind the comparative that on one side, streaming happens at a young age without consent, and on the other side, it happens at an old age with consent. Yep. So that's hope that answers your question. Are there any more questions? Feel free to send them in the chat box.
Hi guys, no more questions. Oh yeah, don't forget to fill the attendance link because that's the important things for you guys to get a participant certificate. And don't forget to fill the feedback links also. Okay, cool. So, Kak Kai, I have a question. So, have you ever feel like in one motions that you don't know, really don't know what the meaning of these motions, for example? So, what did you do when you are in that situation? Especially you don't know, and your partner also doesn't know the meaning of that motions.
Right. Okay. So the first thing, the most obvious thing is to ask, right? Because this is especially true if like there's a long word or there's a complicated context slide. Like I really, really enjoy asking questions. And I sometimes even ask questions for things I already know the answer to, but I just want to make sure, because it's better that I ask many questions and I get a clear understanding rather than I get confused in case building. But assuming you're already confused, like you're already like in the case, like you have some understanding of the motion, but you're confused, I am a proponent, I support, like I think it's useful to really spend a lot of time just understanding the comparative and the motion. So if I'm going to use the same thing, like the same motion, like I would spend 5 minutes out of a fifth, like in BP, even in BP, I would be willing to spend up to 5 minutes just to understand that, okay, proposition supports streaming at a young age, opposition supports streaming at an old age. What's the difference? Consent and clarity. Like your skills are more obvious when you're old than when you're young. What that means, and so once I've done that, I will reword the motion in the dumbest way possible. So the motion is: this house believes schools should aggressively stream students according to their age, ability from a young age. Okay, I would reword it as: this house would mau bikin IPA IPS dari TK. Because like when I have that in my mind, the model becomes clear, the comparative becomes clear, everything becomes clear. And what that allows me to do is that allows me to approach the motion in a much more concrete way, because I've always found that approaching motions in like a conceptual, philosophical way always gets confusing really fast. So yeah, and then I would always, whenever I'm confused, I always refer back to my templates. I would refer back to comparative, common ground. Can I think of anything? I would refer to templates that my seniors gave me. So what's the urgency? What's the solution? What's the justification? I would refer to, if I can fit the motion into one of the templates that I shared earlier, I would do that. And yeah, so that would be three things. So ask questions, simplify the motion, and try to fit it into any template, refer to all the templates that you have. So yeah, I hope that helps.
Even we don't know the status quo right now, is it okay?
I would make up a status quo. So I actually don't think that I don't think that you have to know so many facts to be a good debater. I know a lot of good debaters who don't actually read the news that often. So I found that there's two streams of good debaters. There's the ones that read a lot of news and the ones that don't. And the way you approach it is by using logic. So like, I don't know, what's an example of a motion where I don't know what the status quo is? Like, okay, let's just do something like Afghanistan, Taliban. I haven't read that much into it. I was planning on reading on Afghanistan and Taliban, but I haven't. But like, I just know that the US is leaving. But I can kind of piece together, and I know that the Taliban has taken control, right? So I can kind of piece together like, okay, what does that mean? That means that the US is probably not a good actor. Why are they probably not a good actor? Because like they already failed to get rid of the Taliban before. Like, why is that? Maybe it's because they don't know the culture. Maybe it's because they don't have they don't know like the interest, the nuances of like how Taliban works. Maybe they stayed for too long. Because if they stayed for too long, like they already destroyed the whole country. And once the country is poor, it makes terrorism more likely to spring back up. Maybe the weapons that they used hurt civilians. And maybe that's why like civilians turned into terrorists, which is why Taliban showed back up. There are lots of different answers to that question. Only one of them is true, or like probably one of them is true. I don't know which one is true. And frankly, I don't care which one is true. I want to pick whichever one makes my case stronger. And depending on what the motion is and depending on what you have to support, pick that motion. So I don't mind changing the status quo to be more in line with whatever makes your side's arguments more realistic. Note that you don't just say like, oh, this is the status quo, that's it. You don't just say what the status quo is, but you need to prove it, right? You need to prove it with logic. Like, oh, the reason why the US created Taliban, the Taliban returned after the US left was because they used bad weapons and the weapons hurt civilians, which led to a lot of hatred towards the Taliban. That makes sense. I don't know if it's true or not, but it makes sense. Yeah, so, okay, so that's that. I hope that answers the question. I have another question here. So I'll move on to this next question. The next question is, how do we structure a debate properly? And the answer is, it's hard. Structuring a debate properly is an entire clash. It's an entire seminar in and of itself. And it's the specialty of like a variety of people. So I will, wait 1 second, I have to. Okay, so let me see if I can find my notes. The way I've seen some people case build, sorry, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, then I'm going to share it again when I get my notes back. Okay, so let's see, drive. Yesterday I sparred with a couple of friends. So I'll see if I can get the. Oh, sorry, there are two questions after the debate one. After the structure one. So this is, I was sparring for a couple of friends in for a competition called Newbies. So this was my speech, this chunk here, how the family feels, how social change. I'm not going to get into the details here, but what I want to point out here is I have places where I write things. Like I have the assertion, and then I put points. I have an assertion, then I have points. I have an assertion, then points. This is on the left side is what they say, on the right side is what I say. Sorry, so like this is on the left side, these are my rebuttals. On the right side, this is like my first speaker's arguments. What I want you to notice here is that the way I think is in points. So I'll have like, here's my point. Here's how so I'll have like, here's my point. Then I'll have, here's how to prove my point. Then I'll have examples of it here. Examples of it here. Or I'll like write the proof here. Something like that. So if you structure your speech with points and then you get, okay, 2 points, 1 subpoint here. This is proven by, the example here is, and you just use a lot of signposting religiously, like frequently, it usually becomes much easier to structure your speech. Okay, so there's a longer speech. It's written in Indonesian. Okay, so say as a beginner debater, I'm making arguments that don't connect with the motion. All right, so this is actually something that I've been thinking of for quite some time. I think that the majority of people case build backwards. So a lot of people, they see a motion and they think about their ideas. They're like, oh, I could bring this, I could bring that, I could bring this, I could bring that. So they think about what they want to bring, they think about their ideas, and then they case build from that direction forward. What I think is that you should case build backwards. I think that you should start from what the benefits are. What is the goal of this debate? And if you'll notice, like, if you guys have like templates that get shared around from your institutions, oftentimes in the setup, you're asked to say what your goal is. And the reason why you need to set up your goal is because you need to know where you're going before you can get there. So in order to prevent your arguments from being gak nyambung, the way to do that is to pick out, okay, what is the, again, so we're going back to the conversation on conceptual versus concrete benefits. The reason why people get stuck on conceptual benefits a lot is because I think, at least, they start with their ideas and then they stop when they sound something that sounds like a benefit. Like, all right, oh, this might lead to awareness. Oh, awareness is a good thing. Okay, that's my argument. But I think it's better to start from the end to figure out, okay, this motion is a social justice movement, is a social movement motion, which means what I need to do is I need to figure out, how do I create policy change, or how do I create changes in social norms? Or this is an education motion, so I need to figure out, how do people become smarter, or how does this education lead to more happiness? Like, generally speaking, I think that the majority of motions, the concrete benefit and the tangible benefit in the end is, how does it make people happier? Because, like, for example, one side argues, I talked about this earlier, one side argues you get better education, and the other side argues like, oh, you get better education, but your people are all sad and depressed. It's hard to win it if your people are depressed. So the answer to the question is to figure out where you're going, and then it makes it harder to case build. It makes it harder because you've realized, oh, it's not enough for me to just say, awareness, and that's a good thing. It's not enough for me to just say, free choice is a good thing. But you have to pull that awareness and you have to pull that free choice until you reach a concrete benefit that connects with the motion. So that's how I approach case building in regards to making sure you're connected to the motion. I would also not hesitate to put conclusions at the end of your speech. So once you hit 6:30, you say, okay, what's the conclusion of my speech? Number 1, people are smarter on our side of the house because we provide them better education. And 2, people have more friends that last for a long time because they make these friends from I don't know, like, what, it depends on whatever your argument is. But I would actively allocate time to put conclusions that connect directly to the motion, because that prevents you from having arguments that are disconnected. So I hope that answers your question. All right. I don't know if we have time for one more question, but if anyone wants to ask, then feel free to throw it in. All right, thank you. I think the link for the absent was sent on the top. There's an attendance link, bit.ly attendance MDA, and there's a feedback link, bit.ly feedback MDA. Yep, there we go. It's being resent.
Okay, I think because there's no more questions, Kak, so we close our webinar today. Thank you so much, Kak, for your time, and thank you for everyone who already attend to this webinar today. And see you guys. Thank you so much, Kak, and happy weekend, Kak Kai.
Happy weekend, everyone.
See you
All right.
guys.
Aku leave ya. Bye-bye.